Bicker, here on Talk 1300.
I was just talking off air with Heather Briccetti, the president of the State Business Council. The Business Council is out today with a rating of legislators. And next month, the Business Council is having its annual meeting up on Lake George at the Sagamore at Bolton Landing. We're chatting a little bit about Heather's plan to, is this true, to invite Carl Palladino up there so we could have a kind of an on-stage let me turn up your mic. Redux, a replay of the Battle of Bolton Landing, as some people called it from 2 years ago?
I think a nice rematch is in order.
You're just looking for the publicity, I know.
Absolutely.
Heather Briccetti, Business Council President. This is the second election cycle where the Business Council is planning to endorse candidates. I gather 2 years ago was the first time the Business Council had endorsed any candidate, endorsed then Attorney General Andrew Cuomo running for governor. Today you're out with a Business Council release, a voter's guide, who's favorably inclined to business, who's not favorably inclined to business. I wonder if you could just talk to us about the concept behind it, what the criteria are in this case to make that judgment. Then we can talk about maybe some of the leading figures who are seen as pro or anti-business. And maybe you could just talk to us about the concept behind it.
Sure, and just by way of background, I mean, one of the reasons why we decided it was necessary to do this 2 years ago was we had just come off of a cycle where our legislature had hit us with about $11 billion in new taxes and fees and absolutely no fiscal restraint whatsoever. So we felt it was time to hold legislators accountable, and so that their constituents, who generally like their local elected official, so that they understood how they were voting in a climate where everybody needs jobs. And so our guide is based off of bills that are either good for job growth or bad for job growth, and it's pretty simple.
Talk to us, if you would, about some of those bills, what the bills are.
I think if you look at this year, a real key piece of legislation was the pension reform bill. Obviously, that's positive in our view.
That was the Tier 6 bill.
Yes,
so-called.
Correct, yeah. And also, on the other end of the spectrum, the proposed minimum wage increase, which is it's tremendously popular. If you ask people, do you think it's a good idea? But it's very damaging to small business in particular. And so those are the kinds of bills that we look at. In our rating system, the bill actually has to come to the floor of either house in order for it to be rated. A lot of legislators will introduce bills that sound great, but then they never move them out of committee. So we don't think you should get credit for something that's got no chance.
How many bills were used to do this rating?
I think there's about 14 or 15 bills total. It's different bills in either house because some bills didn't go to the floor in the Senate. In particular, there are fewer bills in our guide that went to the floor in the Senate than in the Assembly. And in the Assembly, it's very surprising, actually, this year. Usually, the vast majority of bills that we're rating that go to a vote in the Assembly are bills that we're opposed to. This year, it was about half positive, half negative, which is just a really kind of an indication of where both houses have gone in terms of thinking about how they impact the economy and jobs.
Well, it's good to hear that they may be focusing more on the economy and jobs than they have in the past. There has been a sense around the legislature and state government for a long time, as you well know, that the money that keeps coming in to spend on the social programs and other programs that so many legislators like seem to come out of a printing press rather than the private sector, which produces the money. Certainly the public sector doesn't produce money, it spends money, it consumes it, and there really is a sense around the Capitol that a lot of these legislators, especially from New York City, don't, for whatever reason, maybe it's just a calculation for their own self-interest, don't connect the health of the private sector with the money coming in that they want for the programs that they favor. If you would, maybe you could talk to us generally how the breakdown goes. Have you found this legislature to be generally pro-business or anti-business? Certainly, by looking at the figures that you put out, the ratings have me seeing that kind of classic view that it's the Republicans who are more favorably inclined to business than the Democrats. But what does the pattern show from your perspective?
Well, I will always start off by saying that this is not a partisan, it's not skewed in a partisan way at all. And I would also say that I think both houses benefit from the leadership of the governor in putting out basically a fiscally sound budget. So both houses got credit for their votes on budget bills which controlled spending and controlled year-over-year growth. But yes, in the Senate, the Senate Republican entire majority scored a 90 because there was really only one bill that came to the floor in the Senate that we feel is not good for business. and they all voted as a conference. And in the Assembly, a large number of the Assembly Republicans scored very high. But, it's not all Republicans. Robin Schimminger in the Assembly, who is a Democrat, scored a 90. We've got a number of Democrats who score over 50%. And to give some credit, and I mentioned this before, that what's coming to the floor is a little different than in the past. 2 years ago, we had probably 50 Assembly members score a 0. We have none this year. So it's a lot different what's being voted on in the Assembly as far as one House bills that are bad for business. A number of those never came to the floor this year, and we are appreciative of that.
I see in the Senate Majority Leader Dean Skelos scores a 90%, and you were talking about how the Republican conference tended to vote for pro-business bills from your perspective. John Sampson, the Democratic leader, got a 70%. And then I'm just struck by the fact that Neil Breslin, the Albany area Democratic senator, got a 60%, lower than John Sampson, which surprised me. I do see that Breslin was absent for one of the votes, and I wonder if that could have affected it.
Right. We don't. We try to be fair about it.
Yeah,
if someone
I
is
hope so.
excused for a vote, it's not counted as a denominator, so to speak, in calculating the percentage. But if they were absent without excuse, it will negatively impact them.
But could one reasonably read this to mean that John Sampson, the leading the Democratic minority leader, is more pro-business than Neil Breslin of Albany?
I mean, certainly that's one way of interpreting it. Before we get to the endorsement process, we will be doing some questionnaires on issues that didn't get voted on. We certainly are not going to let anybody undo their vote on an issue, so those questionnaires won't include issues that came to a vote. But this is only a part of the evaluation as to whether or not we will endorse. And
I'm just looking, if I could, about at another leader, Speaker Silver in the Assembly. It looks like it's blank. Why is that?
I think it's probably onto the next page. But I think he's shown.
Okay. He's given a 50%. Lots of red ink. The negative votes are delineated as red ink.
Yes, we try and make it very obvious by looking at it how someone voted, and people can find our voter guide up on our webpage. But to give the speaker some credit here, he got a 50, but 2 years ago he got a 0. So that's a huge improvement, and we'd like to keep things going in that direction. I think if the legislature continues to trend this way, we'll probably see, we're hoping, more pro-business proposals come to the floor in the Assembly and the Senate.
I see Jack McEnany is retiring. He got a 42%. Lower than the Speaker, and Ron Canistrari also retiring. He got a 50%, same number as the Speaker. Are there any zeros on this list? Did you say there was nobody with a 0?
Nobody with a 0 this time around.
How about the lowest rated person in the legislature?
I think there's a number of members who scored in the 30s, and in the Senate, we have Senator Diaz, who consistently is the low scorer. He's, his district.
Ruben Diaz.
Yeah, very, very social.
25%.
Yeah.
Tom Duane, 30%.
But I should mention that we do wish Senator Diaz well in recovering from his knee replacement surgery. So.
Absolutely, it's nothing personal, right? How about,
no, not at all.
I see in the Assembly, is it Inez Barron from Brooklyn got a 13%? That looks like one of the lowest of any ratings. She's the wife, I believe, of a very radical city councilman.
She is, and you'll see in that one, she was excused for a number of votes, so we do have a kind of a limited
universe or sample, small sample. I'm just looking, is there anyone else who could be singled out as
I like to single out the high scorers.
Okay, who are the highest scorers?
In the Assembly, there's a number of members of the Republican conference, including Minority Leader Brian Kolb and Bob Oakes and a number of others. And then on the Democratic side of the aisle, obviously, Robin Schimminger with a 92, but also Gaberzak, who scored a 69.
Where is he from? I'm not familiar with him.
Gaberzak is from Western New York, and he's been very pro-business. He was a key advocate for a piece of legislation which would repeal a sort of bureaucratic notice requirement. Never made it to the floor in the Assembly, but we did give sponsors credit for it because it was really a signature piece for us that, unfortunately, the Assembly did not take up.
It's interesting to me that there isn't stronger blocks of legislators, Republicans and Democrats, say from economically hard-pressed areas of the state, western New York, the southern tier, the Adirondacks, although there aren't too many people left up there, who come together trying to work for strong pro-business legislation rather than splitting along party lines as they're more likely to do. Has the Business Council, Heather, as far as you know, ever tried to see about assembling coalitions that would put aside partisanship in the interest of trying to strengthen the economies in those areas where the economies are very weak?
You're getting to something that is sort of a key project of mine. I was hired at the Business Council to try and get the organization to be more politically active. The business community has typically not coordinated with each other in supporting candidates, and as a result, we don't have members who are caucused on our issues. And I think that's something that we really need to look to do. We need to build pro-business members in both houses, in both parties, and have them advocating for us in conference when bills come up that are very nice sounding but are very bad for business, in particular small business.
I think people wonder about the business community putting its money where its collective mouths are. In the past, and you and I have talked about this, I think, a couple of times on the air, the Business Council has not had a political action committee or hasn't used one very effectively. But I think I recall you said to me that you are now moving to do that. Is there a Business Council PAC, or what could be seen as a pro-business PAC in New York?
We have a PAC. It's modest because of some very strict restrictions on donations by corporations. But
for those who don't know it, under New York State law, corporations cannot give more than a collective $5,000 a year total.
That's correct.
People who assume that businesses are weighing in with all this money in New York are wrong, although there are some loopholes, including limited liability corporations that can be set up in multiple forms.
Our membership isn't made up of a lot of limited liability corporations. I wish it were, because I certainly think having a big PAC is a long-term goal of ours. But we also, last election cycle, coordinated with Unshackle and NFIB and a number of other groups to spend in a limited number of races to support pro-business candidates, and we're ramping it up a little bit more this year. We've formed a C4, and we are going to be doing some independent expenditures, all with a lot of advice of attorneys to make sure that it's all above board and there's nothing incorrect about how we pursue it. But I'm really hopeful that we'll get a greater degree of participation this time and less of the I'm just going to support my local incumbent regardless of how he voted, which has been my pet peeve for a long time.
Just a follow-up question on the PAC. Does the very controversial Citizens United decision have implications here for super PAC independent expenditures that the Business Council might be able, and others might be able to use to avoid the restrictions of the $5,000 contribution limit under New York State law?
Actually, the two are somewhat unrelated. The $5,000 contribution limit still stands with respect to donations to political parties or PACs. But what it does permit, Citizens United does permit, and there's a lot of hysteria about this, but in reality, it permits independent expenditures, which were legal in New York but have never really been used because of some confusion and interpretation by the Board of Elections as to what kind of spending limits would apply there.
I think we did see them used once, at least once, and that was, I believe, maybe in 2003 or 2, when the last time there was serious consideration being given to legalizing casino gambling, and Donald Trump came in with a huge independent expenditure opposing the legalization of casino gambling.
And that's issue advocacy, and I think, and that's okay. Under any circumstances, you can...
You're distinguishing between using money for candidates and as opposed to...
Correct.
You're right.
Correct. And we've done a fair amount of issue advocacy on fiscal reform issues. We did, last time around, we had Enough Already campaign, which focused on property tax cap, pension reform, controlling state spending, and we're seeing some success on those issues. I'm not going to say it's entirely due to our effort. I mean, I think the economy certainly reinforced our message, and so we probably will be doing more issue advocacy this time around, just to make the voters aware that we're not out of the woods yet. We need to keep the state pointed in the right direction. We need to support pro-business candidates, and especially we need to support keeping New York or making New York a better place for job creation.
When will we see the actual endorsements that the Business Council is going to make of candidates for the legislature?
We generally wait until after the primaries are done. We have not engaged in primaries up to this point. It would just overly complicate things for us. We're sort of new at this.
Yeah.
But I do anticipate down the road we're going to be looking at primaries because I do see that as really the only way to build pro-business caucus, particularly in the Assembly Democratic Conference.
Just a couple of other quick things before we run out of time. The governor's downstairs now. In fact, Steve Greenberg from Siena just came up from down there where he's meeting with the regional economic councils. How do you think that process is going, if you have a feel for how that's working out?
I mean, I think overall, our reaction from members who are involved has been very positive. Of the 200, I think, regional council members, I think about 50 of them are business council members. So we do get a lot of feedback. I think that the experience varies from region to region, but having a concerted, organized effort on economic development and getting organized, coordinated feedback from the regions is a positive thing. That and having the agencies in the same room discussing projects, which hadn't happened in the past.
Do you think the business community does have or continues to have faith in Governor Cuomo? Obviously, you endorsed him 2 years ago before he was the governor, and you've issued statements praising him over the last year and 3/4. Are they still feeling pretty good about him and what he's trying to do?
I mean, I think we all agree that the state is pointed in the right direction. There's a high degree of confidence in his leadership. There's still a lot of work to be done. It's still a heavily regulated state, and we're working with the administration to try and streamline some of those regulations and make it easier to grow jobs in New York.
Well, it was very interesting, I thought, last week. It might have even been a kind of not fully appreciated watershed to have the governor saying he was going to roll back environmental conservation department regulations restricting the expansion of smaller dairy farms. It may be the first time ever that environmental regulations in modern times have been rolled back. What did you make of that?
I mean, I am familiar with it. It's a CAFO rule, a concentrated animal feeding operation, and there was this sort of arbitrary line drawn that if you had more than 200 head of cattle, you were subject to a whole new set of rules that, is there really a justifiable difference between 200 and 201? Where you could point to that as being that's the trigger point. I think it's the exact right thing to do. We should be looking at the dairy industry has been struggling in New York. We're very close with the Farm Bureau, and we support anything to help our dairy farmers. So.
And just quickly, what do you hear, if anything, on hydrofracking decision, natural gas drilling in the southern tier, which is one of the criteria that you use in rating the legislators? The Business Council supports it. The decision has to come fairly soon. There have been reports it would be before Labor Day. Those were wrong. I think it's going to be after Labor Day, but when after Labor Day, we don't know. What have you heard, if anything?
Same as anyone else. That it's the Labor Day is sort of it's in and around that date. We're really hopeful that we can get the ball moving here. I mean, I think we've lost a lot of ground to Pennsylvania. Companies are investing in other states. Obviously, it's New York. We need to have a very thoughtful process. We think that it's time. Let's move forward.
Heather Briccetti, thank you for coming in this morning. Maybe when your ratings come out, you can come back and tell us how you rate the legislators, especially those from the Capital District. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
This
is Fred Dicker live at the State Capitol. We have to take a break for the news. When we come back, Steve Greenberg with the latest, yet another Siena College poll.